that's the culture, how it changed in the 1960s. And of course, this wasn't a spontaneous or an organic reaction to independent or separate events. It was being directed to a large extent, correct?
Yeah, and one of the ways it was being directed was in the music industry, and this comes to a lot of people as a surprise, because today people who are anti-war, and I remain anti-war, tend to think of the counterculture as the heroic rebels and the quote-unquote hawks as representing the establishment, when really I think it was the opposite. But I'm going to have to elaborate on that. Now, did you have David McGowan on as a guest before he passed away?
He was my first guest on my podcast, yeah.
Fantastic. You're going to have to go back and listen to that. But, I've read his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and it was such an eye-opener to discover the links between the hippie music scene and the establishment, in that he focuses in on one particular region of the music industry, which was the Laurel Canyon neighborhood of Los Angeles, and where some of the most famous bands came from. And he points out a lot of things which really changed my view of that. I still think that was great music, but it seems that a lot of that music wasn't created by the people we thought it was, and that they had quite a bit of help in getting onto the airwaves. And one example he gives is Jim Morrison and the Doors. Now, a lot of people still don't know that Jim Morrison was the son of Admiral George Morrison, who was commanding the forces, the naval forces in the Tonkin Gulf at the time of the famed Tonkin Gulf incident. And the Doors had a remarkable success story. Jim Morrison had never had any singing or music experience before, and none of the people in his band had ever been in a band before. The band members never changed. And unlike most bands who have to go through years of changing band members and having a lot of flops before you get a hit, and playing in lounges and coffee houses, these guys just had instant success. They almost instantly, I shouldn't say instant, very quickly had an array of hits, a recording contract. And what McGowan points out is how many of these bands were connected to intelligence and to the military. In their case, their manager, Paul Rothschild, had been in military intelligence, and suddenly they had this recording contract and were able to have their hits showcased across the country. And of course, his career ended just as quickly as it had begun when he died in 1971. But then you look at the rest of the Laurel Canyon crowd, and I even have a embedded this song in the blog post, but the hippie song that best characterized that generation was San Francisco, which was written by Papa John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas for his friend Scott McKenzie. And what most people don't know is that Papa John Phillips, his father was a Marine captain, and he attended military prep schools, went to Annapolis, although he dropped out. His first wife worked for the Pentagon, and his sister worked for the Pentagon for 30 years, military background. Or if you go to Buffalo Springfield, which did a song called For What It's Worth, which really wasn't about a war protest, but nevertheless kind of symbolized the protest movement. They also had meteoric success. They supposedly met on the Sunset Strip in April of '66, yet just 3 months after they formed the band, they already released their first single and were opening for the Rolling Stones at Hollywood Bowl. And it turns out that Stephen Stills attended elite military schools, and David Crosby, who became part of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, was the son of a military intelligence officer. And it's the same thing for Frank Zappa. When I became a hippie and I was listening to music, they said, if you really want to go heavy duty, listen to Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And it turns out, let me just make sure that I get it right here. He was, his father was a chemical warfare specialist. He grew up in military facilities at the Edgewood Arsenal, and his wife, Gail, was a daughter of a Navy nuclear weapons specialist. and she herself worked as a secretary in the Office of Naval Research and Development. And actually, Tim, if you go to to his book, he talks about Jackson Browne came from a career military family. The band America were all Air Force brats. Dennis Hopper's family was military. John Denver's father was a career military officer. It just goes on. And you could say
there's one that reminds me of when you mentioned Dennis Hopper. I was reading Dave McCarran's. This one, his Laura Kanan thing was a part of his web blog. It wasn't a book yet. And so I'm reading it, and he goes, Dennis Hopper, I think he married, what's her name, from the Mamas and the Papas for 2 days or something?
Okay, probably.
What was her name again?
Michelle Phillips, was it?
Michelle Phillips, yeah. Michelle Phillips claimed that the 2 days she was tortured and all types of weird things done to her. And Dennis Hopper said, no, that wasn't true. I just hit her a little bit. And Dave McGowan goes, well, in Dennis Hopper's effed up world, this makes him less of an asshole. It's like, well, I don't only hit her. That's his thing. Only hit her. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, that's okay.
Could have been worse. And with Pizzagate, we know it's been a lot worse.
Yeah.
But
go ahead. I'm sorry. Sorry, I interrupted. That's how Dave McGowan wrote. He'd have this dry humor about right, and you start cracking up reading that stuff. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, it was a terrific writer, but it was really across the boards. The characterization of the military in Hollywood was another one, which is very distinct and unique. You had during the 1960s, you had a lot of counterculture movies. Easy Rider was a famous one, and on Broadway they had Hair, and it constantly spurred on the anti-war counterculture. Yet during the course of the Vietnam War, which lasted for 14 years, there was only one major film that was sympathetic to the war, and that was the Green Berets. And from what I've read of John Wayne's bio, the only reason that movie got made, and as you know, was furiously protested. People were picketing the movie, and I don't think it was that good of a movie, but it was made with the best of intentions. The only reason it got made was because John Wayne was persistent, and he still had so much clout in Hollywood, he was able to get cooperation with it. But if you look at the movies, how they betrayed the military, you had the Bedford incident, where you've got this paranoiac destroyer commander played by Richard Widmark, who ruthlessly pursues a Soviet sub and ends up with the destruction of his own vessel. And you've got 7 Days in May, which is made in 64. Bedford incident was 65. 64, of course, is the year of Tonkin Gulf. And you've got 7 Days in May, where the military is autocratic and they want to seize control of the government to fight communism. They're the bad guys. The military is the bad guys. And the classic example is Dr. Strangelove. And every American military figure in there is portrayed negatively, whether it's George C. Scott as the Pentagon guy, or General Jack Ripper, who launches this unilateral strike on the Soviet Union in order to destroy communism and protect our precious bodily fluids, played by Sterling Hayden. Very negative image. Now, I've got an embedded clip there where he says that war must not be left to politicians, it must be left to the generals. And, of course, he's playing a madman as a general. And I believe that was very deliberate, because we're just launching the escalation of the Vietnam War, and that war was run by politicians, not by generals. The generals were constantly overruled. And so the entire makeup of the Hollywood depiction of our current military was that of paranoiacs and authoritarians. But if you look at their portrayal of the World War II military, even during the war in Vietnam, no protest of that. It was always portrayed as valorous and virtuous. It was definitely a setup. And then you carry it over to television. You had All in the Family. And I've got a clip there of Archie Bunker talking about gun control, and he mispronounces every other word. And his son-in-law is raising his eyebrows and, shaking his head, and the audience is laughing at Archie. And you're definitely being cued by the reactions of the canned laughter and the son-in-law, how you are to react to stupid Archie Bunker, who's supposed to be the prototypal conservative. This is why I'm saying mainstream media was not pro-war. Mainstream media was against the war, which they were dragging out, as we mentioned earlier, interminably. And then if you look at the news coverage, was constantly negative. And I remember getting enraged watching the Huntley-Brinkley report as they interviewed Vice President Key of South Vietnam. I didn't realize how much I was being played. But people don't know this today, but the news media was consistently negative and misrepresented what was going on in Vietnam. For example, they never ceased to tell us about the My Lai massacre, but they never talked about the communist massacres like the massacre in Hue. And they portrayed the Battle of Khe Sanh as a horrendous defeat, when in fact, although the Marines lost 199 dead, the communists lost about 10,000 dead, and they never took the base. But they portrayed it as a defeat. And there was an excellent documentary. It's not perfect. It didn't recognize the existence of the deep state, but it's called Television's Vietnam. And you know what? That has been blacked out. I found it was not on YouTube, no DVDs, but I had an old video cassette, and I've got this friend at a YouTube channel called Federal Expression. I sent him a copy, and he was able to upload a really nice version of it. So we've now got that, resurrected that onto YouTube. But the distortion of what went on in Vietnam by the media was also, much like the media today is driving the Soros protesters, it was feeding the anti-war frenzy. So it's a much different picture. I don't regard the protesters and my hippie friends of that day who were much more into drugs than they were. There's no talk about truth. We weren't a truth movement. It was about drugs, sex, rock and roll, and by the way, we don't want to get drafted. And there was a good reason not to be drafted because, again, they were stretching out a winnable war into an interminable one, but it was not the heroic episode that many people in alt media today believe it was.
Yeah. I think the important point you're making here, you're not endorsing the war. You're citing that the war itself was designed to be strung out to cause maximum damage here at home and abroad, to run up the bills, so to speak. That was a big part of it right there. All the the weaponry and armaments and hardware that was being expended over particularly the helicopters. This was big money, the dredging of harbors and these things. But the whole point is that the reason why the coverage is so negative, isn't there to inform the public, so the public can then go ahead and make a decision at the voting booths, put pressure on the representatives. It's there to antagonize, divide, because obviously World War II generation guys who are then in their 40s and 50s watching the news are going to get mad at the media undermining the troops, and the young guys are going to say, look, they're not, what's going on here? The army's over there engaged in mass slaughter. They're killing everybody. And the whole point of that is to create that divide.
And the outcome was predictable. And you knew which side was going to win this national division because whether it was Broadway or the news media or Hollywood, you had always the doves were portrayed as the good guys and the hawks as the Archie Bunkers and the bad guys. And of course, the war was stretched out until 1975. And then the doves said, "We told you so." And then the whole culture had been changed. And I call this a variation on Stockholm Syndrome. Since we've been defeated by communists, a lot of my generation became the power that they lost to. They became left-wing. We became cultural Marxist over here in America. And then piggybacked onto the anti-war movement were all these other things, the feminist movement. And, I talk in the article, I've got a clip of Timothy Leary, the guru of LSD, saying that the CIA created the entire counterculture. We also know that Gloria Steinem, and I've got a clip of her there, linked to at least, where she talks about her years with the CIA. But they added on the feminist movement and the gay movement and pro-abortion and all these other things that now we see coming to open Satanism and pedophilia and transhumanism and transgenderism. That all goes back to that original counterculture. The counterculture is what the powers that be wanted. They didn't want victory in Vietnam. They wanted to use it to create a national divide, and that national